All right. So I'm also integrating the original design in there that we actually haven't seen in a little while. I've been looking at it for all of my sculpting, like I've mentioned, but there it is. So it's just useful to have that in there as reference. And then just making more notes. Front profile, not as dynamic as the others, meaning I like how he looks from the side and front and rear 3/4, but the front looks a little weak. The fact that these forearms are so symmetrical, I didn't really like. And so now, based on the notes that I took, just writing down in Notepad the notes that I received, or in this case, that I made for myself. I actually have the Photoshop file here, just so I can open that up. So we can see inside here, if I go to image size, that this is, 10K, so it's pretty big. And if we take a look, since it's so big, right now I'm at 50%, so I can clearly zoom in pretty close to this guy. So this could be printed rather large. So doing, a large print that can be on a wall is the easiest way for people to look at something. But if we zoom out and take a look at some of the notes that I pointed out. So first thing being issues with the forearm, or rather the bicep being too cylindrical. And so just looking at it also from a front 3/4, that we can see that it's just, this perfect cylinder right there. It's just a little boring. So I'm just saying also add volume to the width. And so basically at the elbow, it's just not feeling, while from the side, clearly, we've got this massive form here. The fact that from the front, it's relatively skinny. So I'm just saying add some volume into the elbow. Just going to make it feel a little bit more balanced with what it looks like from the side. I'm saying move forearms out. So in the end, an issue with the forearms is that they are very symmetrical, meaning that we can see inside here. Oops. Weird. That if we draw a center line, that they're just so symmetrical. That's kind of boring also. And that, it's all just in such a straight line. It's a result of your base mesh being that way, that you end up sculpting something that looks like that. And so I'm just kind of trying to say in here, well, maybe it doesn't have to be so symmetrical. Because while it definitely looks cool and dynamic from the side, or front 3/4, once we get to the front, I just was feeling like, needs to be worked on a little bit. So front profile, not as dynamic as others. From the top, noticing that the head inside here needs to be resolved a little bit. This shape is just too boring, just hasn't been given any attention. The curve of this protrusion just seemed like it was going against everything else. Everything else is curving this way, right? Things are curving like that, and all of a sudden there's this one shape in here curving the other way. Felt a little out of place. And then also noticing that the spike I haven't gotten to. While I was in Zbrush, I was thinking, oh, maybe it looks cool, smooth like that. But once I got into Photoshop and saw it, it was just like, no. Like basically the way it looks from the side or the front is all right, but maybe a little bit too mechanical. But definitely once we see it from certain angles, like a rear 3/4, we have definitely needs to do some work on that. And then pointing it out again there. And also just noticing that the insertion angle at the tricep there seems a little funky. So those are the notes that I made to myself based on these turnarounds. And so now let's go and get back to our video. Where's my coffee? There's my coffee. So you saw I made a text file where I put those notes down so that I could just sort of work on them one at a time, and as I did them, I could check them off. And so just messing around with the tricep first. Because the tricep, you're often going to have things like in the case of this, where from the side it looked fine. It was just from the back that I noticed, So while you're working in ZBrush, since I jump around a lot, it's easy to forget a certain region that you got to but never finished. And so here I'm just messing around with that. Just trying to resolve it, not just from one angle, and just noodling it. So I was fighting the topology a little bit inside there because the topology was going in a different direction at the insertion point than the direction I wanted it to go in. And then while working on the tricep, realized that there was more than just that insertion point that could be tweaked a little bit, as there were other areas in the back that I hadn't quite resolved, areas in the back of the arm. Now, getting onto the issue of adding width to the elbow region. So using masks to select a specific muscle group, and then going in and adding some volume to it. And then separating to the other muscle group. And so, and then just giving it a little bit of a harder line. Just increasing some of that definition and then sort of blending it in with the clay tubes brush. That's the nice thing about the clay tubes brush, is that you can use it to add or remove volume, but you also can use it to blend. That's, one of the big things of why I like that brush so much, is that it adds volume, it removes volume, and it blends things together. Because the clay tube brush also smooths while it brushes in a way. So now doing the same thing on the other side. And using the move brush. Okay, and then now creating another mask. This time I want to be able to work on that front, sort of armored shell part of the forearm. So I'm creating a mask for that. Because now that I made the elbow region thicker, I now need to make this thicker. But I'm going to try and do it in a non-symmetrical way. And also really increase how much it sticks out from the rear and from, rear 3/4 or from behind, just so it's really quite a bit wider. So I'm not really increasing the width of the arm underneath it, just that armored shell. And then I'm using inflate just to take what looks a little bit too pinched of an edge and round it out. So now it looks a little bit more dynamic. So At this point, I was definitely feeling a little bit better about how he looked from the front. Because once I saw that in Photoshop, I definitely was kind of like, yeah, it just looks a little, it's like I definitely, any character you can't assume you're only going to see from the side. Seeing a character from the front is going to be a pretty common thing. So he has to work from the front. He can't only look cool from the side, even though that's the angle that I did the design from. So I'm just bulking him out a little bit now. And then also noticing that the side of his ribs felt like they needed a little bit more volume. So I'm just masking things out. Being anal about it. Blurring the mask by just clicking on it. And then adding a little bit of volume into the ribs. And then moving to the ones behind. So I can pull that out a little bit. And then just going in and cleaning it up a little. And then just little touch-ups. I'm just messing around with the move tool. Sometimes doing something extreme gives you interesting ideas. So now moving on to that bicep. So like I said earlier, it was feeling way too cylindrical, just boring. So now I'm going to go in there and just try and do some stuff to make it an interesting form. So I'm just starting with a line that's, obviously there's, the two heads of the bicep, which is where the idea comes from, but in the end, that's not what I'm going to really use it for. I'm just going to use it as a sort of a graphic line to use to build some other shapes off of. So stuff that starts to separate it from feeling human to feeling a little different. Trying to figure out how that line terminates. So, but now it definitely looks a little bit cooler from a front or a front 3/4. Now I just needed to resolve it from the side. So it's just a completely made up, invented thing. This is not based on anything other than just interesting shapes. Then decided I'd do the same thing with the tricep on the back, just some sort of random opposing angled shape in there. Just so I'm continuing the idea from the front to the back, again to keep things consistent. And so going down with a list of things I needed to fix, moving on to the top of the head. So just checking things out from a bunch of angles and then saving before I move on. You can see I'm at this point doing a lot of tumbling before I do anything because I'm just trying to figure out what to do. Because again, I'm not sure. Thinking, 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 thinking. Or like I said earlier, procrastinating by tumbling. Changing materials, just to see if that helps me see what I should do. But I switch back. But you can see I'm really tumbling like crazy just to make sure that the things that I do are working from every angle. So at this point it's becoming a very sort of, slower process. Because I need to, the head is a pretty important thing, so I don't want to rush it. So changed my mind on that one. Felt it was intruding too much with all the little curves on the side of the head. Now just trying something extreme. And then just trying to decide if that, in the end, helped. And it did, I think. Instead of being all big oblong ellipse, it now has some kinks to it, some different changes in direction. So definitely at this point I'm feeling happier about this guy from the front. And so I now decided to do a quick render of him from the front just to compare in Photoshop what changes I made. And we can see inside here, if we compare the head, it's subtle, but you can see here it's just this big round arc, while in here, it's got changes in direction. So here, for example, it's this curved shape, but here now we have this little kink right there. Here, completely flat. Now we have this kind of dynamic little cross shape. So it's subtle, it's still the same guy, but those little tiny shapes made a big difference on me being happy with them. And then also inside here we can see that, this thing was curving in, now it's curving out, so that also helps change the profile or silhouette of this entire region by just changing the angle of that little shoulder bone thing that's sticking out. And then the forearms now are also much improved. We can see the extra thickness right inside here compared to that side. And also the fact that these are now no longer symmetrical. So here you can see pretty much perfectly symmetrical down a center axis. Now it's got a curve to it, and it's also much thicker. Just comparing it one more time, just with the proper shader, so that comparing apples to apples. And then now, saving and moving on to this guy. This guy definitely took me a little while, because there was obviously lots of different, at this point I hadn't thought about it. I assumed for a while that it was going to be just something smooth. And so this I messed with for a while. But sometimes, you just try a few different things until you end up somewhere that you're happy. So instead of only showing everything working out perfectly, then I might as well also include everything. Because I'm literally showing, hopefully you're not bored to tears, but I'm, showing literally every second of me making this guy, and therefore that's also going to include stuff that might be, a little boring, because not everything is a super exciting, perfect canned demo. Because that was, the struggle. I kind of assumed, like, masterclass, I'm going to try to just make it like 2 hours, like everybody else is going to do. And I just have a bad habit lately of just talking too much. But I think it's just in the interest of being thorough, because, yeah, I could go and say, like, oh, yeah, I used Maya and Zbrush, and there it is, and done. But that doesn't really help. So masking, inflating along that edge of the mask, just to make it feel like that thing was sort of being pulled out of some skin. And then just inflating it a little bit more on the inside of the mask, just to blend that in a little bit better. That little ridge I'm trying to add inside there is just based on something that's in the sketch and the original design, so I'm just trying to make sure I've got that in there. But then once I added that in there, I decided, oh, maybe it could be something more interesting. So maybe there's like a recess. So maybe the top half of the spike is different than the bottom half of the spike. But in that area, since I'm going kind of against the topology, I'm getting a little bit of faceting. Now moving on to the top half, experimenting with different alphas, just saying, maybe it's just split down the middle and simple, maybe it's got ridges. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just going to go and do the whole thing with clay tubes like I've done everything else. Maybe not. Thing was getting in the way, so I had to hide it. Mask this guy out, because finally it's like, all right, I need a mask. Which I painstakingly make. And then saved out that mask. And then going and grabbing some of the alphas that I've made and experimenting some more. Because since this thing comes out of his kickstand as like this sort of spike protruding weapon thing, then I guess since it's coming from, inside his body, maybe it's veiny. But eventually I end up deciding that it's a little much. So now I try doing it negative, so inverting, so subtracting instead of adding using the vein mask. And then trying inflate and getting some interesting texture out of that. But no. Little ridges? No. ostrich leg texture that I made. I'm grabbing a whole bunch of them now. Trying a skin one. Trying it as a sub instead of an ad. Seeing what it looks like if I do it, and then blur it. Trying another alpha. I just figured since I used an alpha on the rear leg that maybe I could do something inside here. And started to realize that that might be a direction to go in. And I'm starting to get closer to something I liked. So I had to do it a few times to get the right scale and intensity. And then kind of decided that maybe that was, you know, kind of cool. I mean, you're not going to really see it much, so it's really not that important. But it's at least interesting and makes it feel more organic. And then I kind of knew pretty quickly that that other alpha would work for the top. Kind of feels like a bunch of little knuckles. So it kind of gives the feeling like this thing could bend, like it has joints inside it, which will help explain how it kind of is able to go inside the other thing, because it's bendy. And then using another alpha to just get some bumpiness on there. And there you go. So we experimented quite a bit to see if we could find something that we liked. And I finally did. And now just using the clay tubes brush and smoothing just to create some sort of little lines on that spike. And there we go. And then I need to mirror that to the other side, so just smart resim and X at each subdivision level, starting at 0 and going up. And then checking it out with the rest of the model. I did all that stuff on layers, by the way, on the spike, for obvious reasons. All right, so at this point, I've made all of the tweaks I needed to make based on what I observed earlier. I fixed the head, the bicep, back of the arm, the width of the forearm, the spike. So now I need to render this guy out again to do a new set of turntables. So for this one though, I'm not going to render the turntable or the images with all the different materials. Now I'm just picking the one material to render my turntable. So I can then have a revised PSD of turnarounds with the changes made to the model that I can then send off for approval. Saying, hey, I made your changes. Is it okay? So, going real quick through all this. And then pointing out there the fact that, you know, you have to be aware that since I'm doing my turnarounds with perspective on, even if you have just very slight perspective, for your front side views, a slight perspective isn't that big of a deal, but for your top and bottom views, it makes a pretty big difference. So I chose to leave perspective on just so that it was kind of obvious to you in the PSD. But now I'm rebuilding my new turnaround, trying to get it to match my original. So I'm grabbing the new renders that I did and putting them on top of the original renders that I did, just so that my new turnaround has the same general presentation style as the previous one. Don't want it to have a completely different style because then you're going to throw people off. Because again, it's comparing apples to apples. If this one had a completely different shader as the other one, then it's kind of like, hey, am I analyzing the model, or am I now analyzing a new shader? You don't want to confuse people. So now just making sure all these things are lining up. And then that's my new turnaround with a new date on it. So I can go in and change the date as I save it out. Although I just realized I put the date on the wrong layer. It's like, oops. Make a new 7. And then again, just kind of trying to blend them together. Flattening it all, getting rid of those notes, because those are old notes, so they're there for now, but I'm going to get rid of them. I'm comparing back and forth between the original and this one, so I can just see before and after making the changes, so that I can decide if things have improved. Now getting rid of the notes and saving it. And there we go. So now we have our revised turnaround with changes made. Ready to send off. And at this point, with the model, I was feeling, being my only person involved in this to make a decision, I decided that I was cool with it. It's always simple to make changes later, but at this point, I had done enough. It was time to move on. Because again, this guy, or the Zbrush file that we've been looking at, I've spent a day and a half doing this sculpt, and that's more than enough time. I mean, that's, on some levels too much time, but this guy has a lot of details and a lot of things to figure out. So now, like I said, I'm not the fastest sculptor in the world, so and I know that there's certain people who can sculpt something like this in a day or half a day. Some of you out there are probably thinking like, of course, and some of you out there are thinking like, really? That's freaking crazy. But yeah, there's some really fast people out there. But for me, this is, a couple days, and it's not done, meaning that we have the general idea. The idea of the design has been fleshed out in 3D from a orthographic side view. Most of the forms are fine. I can go and change them later, but it definitely, the general form at this point we're saying is approved. Like, this guy is ready to move on to doing some animation tests or shader tests, just to be like, okay, let's see him move. And so by moving on with this model into Maya now, and getting ready to, rig them and that kind of stuff, the things that are left to do on this guy, if I were to decide to, because this again is not a model we're working on for a final shot. We're working on this for a creature development, creature design pipeline. And so meaning this is like pre-production. And so it's just supposed to get the idea across, but not be final. So obviously, if I was trying to do this guy as a sculpt for a final shot, I'd need to spend another day or whatever on this model, going in and smoothing out all these little clay tubes, brush lines, and making it look more real, meaning that it feels more like real, flesh and skin on top of all these muscle groups with all of the appropriate, wrinkles and tension and all that kind of stuff. So that is not, a part of my model in here. That would be, for me, another pass. There's certain people that as they sculpt, they automatically do that. For me, that's something that tends to come in as a separate pass, but that's more time. And it's unnecessary because those are things that you only see up close. Right now, from a distance, he's kind of looking fine. And so definitely good enough to move on to our next phase of development for this guy. We've fleshed out the idea of the model and the design, and now I want to get this guy in Maya so I can, start to see this guy do something. So that's going to be the next step. Is we've got our approved model. Now we need to go from ZBrush to Maya.